Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you, there is a further development with the melanoma vaccine based on mRNA. There is a possibility that certain enzymes could change a donor's blood group, although very preliminary. The relationship between let's say a herbal supplement called Kava and liver damage. The uncomfortable and ever more daunting developments around bird flu and how it has now infected yet another species. Wild animals practicing herbal medicine, of a kind anyway. The bizarre proposition that potatoes should be relabeled as a grain, and thankfully how it was rejected. And how curiosity has found oxygen on Mars that it could indicate somewhere at least somewhat habitable. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the mRNA vaccine for melanoma that is being trialled in the UK, a country notoriously famous for its sunny weather. Facetious jokes aside, the choice is based largely around the institutes involved, the National Health Service, and the universities. Primarily, we're talking about the National Institute of Health and specifically the University of College London hospitals. The relationship is important as this is not just a generic all-purpose vaccine. Specifically, it is a customized patient individually tailored vaccine for melanoma. It is, for all intents and purposes, very much like if you had the COVID-19 vaccine, which is based on mRNA, but that each dose of it was made for you individually and for your particular kind of COVID-19. It allows for a targeted and very specialized treatment to be done. What is at least somewhat more important for this is that not only will it treat the cancer as it is, which is good news, but because of what it is and how it works, it would prevent that same skin cancer coming back a second time or even a third time, because the body has a memory in the form of immune cells that are specially made to memorize what it's encountered before. And so, if for whatever reason another melanoma started developing, the immune system would be able to identify it, attack it, and destroy it before it ever became a serious issue. This is not a small level trial either. This is now a phase 3 clinical trial, which means it's going to be fairly widespread, it's going to involve a lot of individuals, and it's going to be, ideally, a great start to the next massive boom in vaccines, where we see more and more coming out, and even better yet, if they can be customized to individuals. For example, this vaccine uses 34 antigens. Those are sites on the tumor or cancer that are able to be targeted by the immune system. If, and this is a massive if, the same thing was possible for other diseases, we could effectively make a vaccine for just about anything that would be super effective. And we're not talking about Superman levels of effective, we mean like it's going to win no matter what. It doesn't matter if Batman's involved or not. In other news, we have what is honestly disappointing, but not that surprising. A spa in New Mexico has been offering vampire facials. This sounds awesome, at least if you're into that kind of thing. It's both a facial and it has some sort of wantonly fancy name to it. It makes you feel different and special, even if it's really not. Well, yeah, you don't want to be having these, at least not since they've started causing HIV. Yeah, at least 5 individuals have been infected with HIV after being treated at this spa. Mind you, it's an unlicensed spa, which shouldn't be conducting the treatments that it is, but nonetheless, the CDC has traced back at least 5 cases to it, which isn't great. The concept is bizarre anyway, and why it would be popular is mind-boggling. What happens is a bizarrely stupid and weird process. mostly because it has no obvious benefits. What happens is that they take about 10 milliliters of blood out, if not less. The platelets are separated from this, generally through centrifugation, and then the platelets are injected back in. They're injected back in using microneedles to parts of the scalp, cheeks, and brow. What benefit this could possibly provide is beyond comprehension, as platelets only provide the benefit of clotting when there's damage, which means all you've really done is cause clotting. This is why you should not rely on fancy naming schemes when it comes to, well, trying to find treatment options. In other blood-related news, but at least somewhat more promising and certainly based on licensed practitioners, it's the possibility that a bacterial species within your GI tract could be contributing to your blood type. Well, specifically in this case, it's not your blood type, but it's realistically any blood type, and it can convert the blood from A, B, AB into O, which O is the universal donor. That is, anybody can receive this blood, in very broad terms, and not have a reaction to it. The trick here is that the O blood type does not have any antigens on its surface. These are the things that would be recognized by the immune system and therefore targeted, and it's why, for the most part, people can receive type O blood without an issue. However, type O can't receive A, B, or AB blood, because that does have an antigen on its surface. But it's also the same reason someone with type A blood can't get type B and vice versa. If you're in a hospital and you have a need for blood and there is none of your blood type available, typically you would be given a type O blood. However, the issue is, if that's happened, there's a good chance that you aren't the only individual who needs blood, and that the type O blood that's available has been used up for those who do actually need it, initially, or at least prior to your reliance on it. The question then becomes, how do you get more blood? And the solution here is surprisingly ingenious, but also not a new idea. It's an enzyme. That enzyme strips away the markers on the surface, or the antigens, and it produces type O blood from any other type of blood. Well, A, B, or AB blood to be specific, but what is important here is that unlike previous methods that took a long time, needed a lot of specialized circumstances, effort, and resources, this is much quicker and much easier. Fundamentally involves incubating blood for about 30 minutes at room temperature with the enzymes, leading to most if not all of the blood being converted into type O. Further, this enzyme does more than just strip away the type A and type B antigens. There are a range of other factors that are further able to define your blood group, and these were also stripped away, leaving behind what could be very simply described as a almost purely type O blood. And ideally, if you have a negative blood type for A, B, or AB, it would produce type O negative, the best blood that you can have available for giving to people when you don't have the specifically tailored or customized blood for their purposes. In other news that's medically related, but this time coming down to the behaviors of individuals and the transition away from consuming tobacco in the form of cigarettes and so on to the use of vaping products and the interesting and unexpected problems that it has led to. In this case, a uncomfortable amount of uranium and lead in urine. Well, weirdly enough, it's in teens who have been using vaping products, which is another issue again entirely, as lead will affect, to a certain extent, teenagers more than it will adults, but it's not good for anybody. But at the same time, well, uranium, not good no matter who you are or where you are. What is strange about this research, and it does indicate that there's probably more going on than is obvious at the surface, is there was a 30% increase in the amount of lead and twice as much uranium in urine for those who use vaping products regularly versus those who use them occasionally. Now, this could indicate that either the data collection was somehow flawed, or that there's a difference in the way metabolism is going on between the two groups. The other oddity is that those individuals who preferred sweet-flavored vaping products had a significantly higher amount of uranium compared to those who had something like menthol mint-flavored products. It is very important for us to point out that not only is this a comparatively small study, but it did lack a control group. On the other hand, the findings are consistent with other similar research, which does indicate that unregulated products tend to have a big issue, especially if it's something like, in this case, vaping. But then again, any supplement is the same problem. This is something we see with Kava. Kava is another supplement, or specifically a herbal supplement. It's generally considered a quasi-sedative. That's because it's supposed to have a calming effect. It's something that is used traditionally throughout large parts of Oceania, basically the Pacific Ocean and the islands therein. Pretty much think from Hawaii down to Australia, and you'd have a good idea about where we're talking about. The problem with this is that Kava is known to be linked to issues to do with your liver. Basically, it can cause enough damage that you can then get liver failure, and once your liver starts to failure, death is basically inevitable. And that's the problem here. Although, as a traditional supplement, it's not regulated, and it's somewhat widely available depending on what country you're in, it also has these major side effects. And because it's not regulated, there's no control and consistency about the amount of active products within it, and generally speaking, the actual amount of Kava itself, which can be between none and all of it, you have to worry. And so the widespread use, or at least increasingly widespread use, would indicate that we need to worry, and for very good reason. There are extreme differences in the methods used to prepare Kava, depending on what it's being sold as. For example, if we're talking about the traditional preparation methods, it's generally used in conjunction with water. Since the water is extracting it, and there's a significant difference in the ability of water to pull different chemicals out due to polarity, it's not as strong a dose. However, because it's not as strong a dose, you don't get as much of a hit from it. This would obviously mean that your livers are less likely to be harmed. By comparison, people who are extracting it with, say, ethanol, basically any of the typical alcohols, would have a significantly greater amount, and this is a concern, especially if we're talking about industrial production for supplements, quasi-industrial anyway. Therein lies the problem. There is a large gap between traditional preparation and what is sold as a product to the mass consumer. Further to that, since this is a supplement, there is practically no regulation about it. And further yet, because it is a traditional supplement, those who are not using it traditionally are able to basically get away with labeling it as, oh, this is just how it is and always has been. Yeah, but is and always has been isn't necessarily a good thing. Is and always has been applied to children dying before they turned 1, and we've certainly not supported that. Although in this case, most of those consuming this are going to be adults, so they can make their own dumb decisions, but so long as they are aware of what their dumb decision is. It's informed consent. And that's the crux of everything so far. There is a world of uncertainty around Kava, mostly down to the fact that there is a wide range of preparations that are used, and none of them are consistent. Shifting to news about something that effectively always has been, we have bird flu. But bird flu continues to be a major concern, and not just because of our own human exposure to it historically, and the fact that it always has been and always will be, but because it has yet again managed to make a leap to another species. This is what the worry is. The concern is that cats on a farm, specifically a dairy farm, have been infected by bird flu from milk that's been contaminated with bird flu. This is cows that have been infected, which is a concern, but that was already well published and known about, and now the milk from those infected cows has infected another species. That is the problem. Now, as much as cats are assholes, We have no desire to see them dying randomly and wantonly. The way to prevent that in this case is actually quite straightforward. Don't give the cats raw milk. In fact, don't give anyone or anything raw milk. However, this is some sort of recent new fad, and that new fad involves drinking raw milk, so, well, nothing to be done about that. Well, except the obvious solution of pasteurize your milk and don't drink raw milk. And this would obviously have the effect of not just protecting arsehole cats, but in fact any species, because the process of pasteurization will kill the virus. The other element to this, which is a worry of sorts, is that although cats are known to be vulnerable to being infected with bird flu when they're exposed to birds, generally speaking through hunting them, the exposure and infection through milk is a new scenario, and that's a worry, as this is a first-of-kind report. In slightly less depressing news, we have the idea of being able to make mice smell with the scent and ability of a rat through hybridizing their brain. This sounds kind of worrying and sort of like Pinky and the Brain, except these were mouse brains grown with the cells of a rat's brain, which allowed them to have both abilities, or at least both animals' strengths, since both animals' parts of the brain were able to interconnect and interact. The way this research works, let's say, is in a respect similar to IVF. What they've done is they've fertilized a mouse ovum and then allowed an embryo to start growing. Once it got to the blastocyst stage, that's when there's a large number of cells that have formed a sphere, they introduced the rat stem cells into the developing embryo. This allows for the two sets of cells, the different lines, to grow together in parallel and obviously together. Because they're growing together, the two different lineages of cells become practically inseparable, growing alongside and into each other. This ensures that there is a degree of connectivity that is reliably and predictably present. This is drastically different from other methods where they've used organoids and tried to implant them, or similar methods using stem cells in fully grown mice embryos, or fully grown mice for that matter. This is why the research is somewhat distinct and separate. Understand, there's similar research, it's just not based on the same time of implantation. The research might seem completely useless. After all, what benefit is there in being able to know if a mouse can smell like a rat? And it's not so much that development that is key here. To be clear, that's useful in some ways, but what is useful and key here is that it shows that there are ways to create better and arguably demonstrate what needs to be done for, say, computer and brain interface devices to more effectively allow them to do what needs to be done. The other benefit is that it shows a way for us to be able to create cat girls. In further animal-related news, we have orangutans practicing medicine, of a kind anyway. The Max Planck Institute has published research showing that orangutans that have been observed using plants as a form of medicine and treating various injuries. What is interesting is that the plant in question is a traditional medicinal plant used to treat a variety of wounds, and medical conditions for that matter. The fact that the orangutan took the time to collect the leaves, which weren't exactly easily accessed, chew on them, apply them, and continue to repeat this process until the entirety of a reasonably large injury was covered, is an indicator that not only are they using the analgesic effects of said plant, but are deliberately and very conscientiously practicing what could be considered a form of very primitive medicine. As fun and exciting as apes of various kinds showing more and more human-like behavior is, we also have the weirdness of birds. Specifically, how it is that a flock of birds, and this can be hundreds, thousands, and even millions in some cases, of birds all flying together but somehow never seeming to crash into each other and maintain their cohesion as a result. It's weird. how do they do it? And it comes down somewhat to physics. Well, yeah, this might seem boring, but in a way it's actually quite interesting. But interesting in that it explains a concept that without physics just doesn't make sense. And sadly, no, the birds aren't communicating with each other exactly, nor are they using telepathy. Instead, there appear to be 3 rules that dictate how the entire flock behaves. First, rather obviously, each of the birds is trying to avoid colliding with the other birds around it. As you can imagine, this would be a rather unfortunate event as it would create a cascade. Second, each bird will try and stay near to other birds of the same species, which again makes sense. You want to keep the flock together. It's what makes them look like a massive cloud. Finally, each bird will fly in the same general direction as the rest of the birds are flying, and this would indicate that they're all going in the same direction, and because they're all trying to stay together, you get the general consensus of direction and function. Together, this will tell you most of what's happening, but not all of it. Specifically, there's still a large gap between the models that use these 3 rules and the observed behaviors of birds. And this is where the final element comes into play, where physics gives us that final clue to finish the puzzle. It is the physics of flight and aerodynamics. The key here is that because of how birds are shaped, and rather obviously being effectively the inspiration for aircraft, we can compare aerodynamics and how they affect an aircraft with how it would affect a bird. In this case, by having a bird affected by various forces, if they begin to shift out of position within the flock, the forces that are at play, particularly through aerodynamics, air pressure, and so on, will more or less push the bird back into where it came from, ensuring that they all stay where they're meant to stay, unless they are beginning to try and apply one of those 3 prior existing rules. This doesn't give us all of the answer, it's just enough of a start that if people are inclined, they can continue to dig away, or chip away, or is it peck away at the role of flocks of birds and various factors that decide how they work. Going to agricultural news, we'll start with what is a case of dumb in America. There was a bill proposed to classify potatoes as a grain. Now, generally speaking, grains are something small and grow above ground on a stalk, whether it's rice, wheat, barley, rye, or anything else, even corn for that matter. They grow very clearly in a cluster above ground. Potatoes do not fit this bill. So the justification had to be something weird, and it was. It was that potatoes were high in starch content. And yes, they are. Generally speaking, potatoes have up to about 25% starch, and certainly some cultivars and varieties can be more than that, but it's a modest middle ground. So why would you compare potatoes, which have 25% starch, to, say, wheat, which has 55% starch? Yeah. This is why the bill failed. The bizarre paranoia behind this is all premised on the concerns that the USDA would reclassify potatoes as a grain, and that there would be consequential concerns about whether or not you could substitute potatoes and grains, whether or not potatoes were unhealthy, and so on. All of which, according to the USDA's public response, is basically nonsensical paranoia. In other agricultural news related to plants and vegetables particularly, we have tomatoes and how an heirloom seed company may have made a slight faux pas. Well, not a slight faux pas. It may have been a massive faux pas, as they had possibly included a picture of a genetically modified tomato on their front cover, claiming that it is believed to be the first and purplest non-GMO tomato in the world. Except it may well have been one of the genetically modified tomatoes by Norfolk Healthy Produce. Oops. The giveaway in this case is not so obvious. After all, Your first thought may be, well, it's a purple tomato, they've been grown for years. Yes, except purple-skinned tomatoes have been grown for years. Tomatoes with purple flesh? No, and that's the issue. Despite consistent and reliable efforts across decades, it hasn't been possible to get a tomato to have purple flesh using traditional breeding methods. That means things like hybridization, crossbreeding, etc. haven't been able to achieve this. There's something important when we talk about heirloom seeds that are meant to be using these methods, and therein lies the crux of the problem. The only method that has successfully achieved purple flesh is genetic modification. The controversy doesn't just end with that though. There was communication and discussion between both the GMO company and the heirloom seed company about whether or not these were in fact effectively contaminated with the purple tomato from the GMO company. And therein lies the problem. Although no clear conclusion was ever reached, it does appear that Baker Creek heirloom seeds have not only withdrawn the product from their catalogue, but destroyed their entire stock of seeds. Which would indicate that yes, actually, it was somehow, and certainly closely enough related to the genetically modified tomato, that they weren't willing to carry it. The other issue here is how did seeds get from a UK closed field to somewhere in France, and then from France to America? That's the issue, and it's theorized that over 20 or so years that the purple flesh tomato has been in development, that people have had access and misappropriated the various seeds from it, and these have been spread. The consequences of this are mostly benign. That is, there's a certain loss for Baker Creek heirloom seeds, and the company that makes the purple flesh tomato that's been genetically modified has received unexpected publicity. The other element to that, though, is there's a lot of controversy now as to whether or not, in this case, the purple flesh tomato could overtake all other species, or at least cultivars of tomato. And the answer is likely no, and that's because the tomato is self-pollinating. This means that it's only going to spread its pollen to itself, ensuring that other cultivars of tomato aren't really exposed to it, unless you start to deliberately crossbreed them. And next we have news about diversity of life that's completely unrelated to genetic modification and hybridization. Instead, it's having to do with the Earth's magnetic field and life, at least the start of life anyway. 590 million years ago, so fairly recently, the Earth's magnetic field collapsed, and this is what led to a bizarre phenomena. The magnetic field has a massive role to play in stopping cosmic radiation. When it collapses, that cosmic radiation dose rises suddenly and drastically. Well, suddenly and drastically in terms of the global and geological timescale we're talking about here. And that's what triggered the huge increase in different kinds of life and various adaptations to it over time. In fact, it has some fairly major implications. First of all, the cosmic radiation will have an effect on any kind of DNA, leading to an increase in mutation rates. Those mutation rates would almost all have been negative, but there would have been occasional mutations that were beneficial. The other effect is that due to the increasing oxygen levels at the same time, there would have been an increased ability to have life. So now we have both more mutations and increased basic requirements, basically water and oxygen on Earth along with sunlight, to produce very early life forms. Now, we are talking about tiny organisms here. It would likely have been things like bacteria to start with, and then maybe macroscopic animals. But we're talking very small, very preliminary. As in, we would have a single-celled organism and maybe an organism with a few cells, becoming multicellular, but still very limited in its size. To be clear, this is not a short-lived phenomena either. The period in which the magnetic field was gone lasted about 26 million years, more than enough time for life to start evolving, whether it's just simply adaptation or, through virtue of that missing magnetic field, a mutation. Further to that, because these are all relatively small life forms and they could live within the oceans where the massive amount of water would provide a certain amount of protection from radiation once they had, let's say, started to evolve, it would indicate that there are ways for mutations to be sustained. This is supported by the fact that most of these species that are recognized from this time tend to be things like primordial sponges, sea slugs, and anemones. That would indicate that most of the life forms growing at this point were very primordial, unsurprisingly, but that they also lived primarily in the oceans. The interesting thing is that most of these species basically became a dead end. Nonetheless, it does show that through the increasing concentrations of oxygen, the lack of magnetic field, and the presence of radiation, life can survive and multiply, although some of them were also evolutionary dead ends. This brings us to the final news item, which is also related to oxygen, but not oxygen on Earth, rather, we're talking about Mars. On Mars, the Curiosity rover has found an area where it's likely that it's entirely possible life could have been present billions of years ago. The argument for this is based on the presence of a specific kind of mineral. It's manganese oxide. Now, on Earth, manganese oxide is formed where there is a high amount of oxygen and, rather obviously, manganese. When manganese is exposed to oxygen, you get manganese oxide. Therefore, in order for this to form on Mars, and specifically in the Gale crater, that crater had to have been filled with water and had to have the presence of oxygen in enough concentrations to start reacting. That reaction would need to be, at least based on Earth examples, facilitated through specific microbes. For example, on Earth, where we have life that uses photosynthesis. On Earth, we see this phenomena with algae. That is the massive blooms of red, blue, and green growth you see on water regularly when there's an increase in nitrogen, and these species are Earth's major producer of oxygen, much more so than trees. However, unlike trees that fix carbon, algae just produces oxygen. And that's one way it is entirely possible that Mars could have achieved this result. Algae on that lake surface could have been making oxygen, with some going into the atmosphere and some going into the water. Further, this would not have been a flash in the pan, so to say. The requirements to form manganese oxide are thousands of years of an oxygen-rich environment. That would mean that the algae or whatever other microorganism was responsible for this would need to have been present for a fairly long time. Of course, it might not have necessarily been alien life. It could also have been a fairly short-lived event in terms of a meteorite impact releasing a significant amount of oxygen into the area, and this is what could have caused the reaction. So it's not a necessarily definitive sign of, well, in this instance, alien life of a kind, but it does indicate that it is likely, if not more appropriate to say, possible that Mars had life. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.